Did you know that the power vested in the president isn't as clearly defined as you might hope? In fact, it has been debated fiercely since the death of Washington. If you just read the Constitution and nothing else, the answer isn't clear. Can, as President Trump once said, the president stand in the middle of Times Square and shoot a man? Is the president the sole vestige for executive power in the United States? Or do the agencies, defined within the executive branch by Congress, share in that executive power? In this video, we're going to take a different look at the President of the United States. We're not going to think in terms of political parties, but rather constitutional law, and the history of legal theories that permitted or constrained the president's actions. Let's talk about unitary executive theory. In the United States, our laws are founded in common law, laws rooted in tradition and custom, and stare decisis, or standing by things decided. But these systems alone cannot fully address the novel conditions observed or unanticipated decisions made by any branch of government. Where there is broad language, though, you will find lawyers to interpret it to their clients' interests, and the language found in Articles 1, 2, and 3 of the Constitution is very broad. This leaves wide room for interpretation. Technological advances, wartime emergencies, natural disasters, or unprecedented executive actions by their nature remain uncertain within the law and Constitution until a specific challenge to that application of power arises which prompts judicial review or legislative clarification. Take the case of Youngstown Sheet and Tube Company v. Sawyer, 1952, where, in the midst of the Korean War, President Truman seized steel production facilities from their private owners in order to circumvent a strike by United Steelworkers of America for higher wages. Before 1952, Franklin D. Roosevelt seized all variety of factories and mines during World War II. Theodore Roosevelt seized coal mines in 1902 during a strike, and even Abraham Lincoln seized railroads and telegraph lines during the Civil War. Truman had no reason to believe he did not have this power. It had been used as a wartime power for at least 90 years prior to his presidency. Until this case, until the constitutional interpretation was written into standing precedent, it was not illegal for the president to seize private property. Congress had complained before, unions and their lawyers had fought against this before, but the president could still steal your business under Article 2 powers. But we can take these theories back to the beginning of the country. These theories didn't spring up from the void. They grew from real conflicts. The unclear language of Articles 1 and 2 was the grounds for disagreement between Andrew Jackson and the Second Bank of the United States, a conflict known as the Bank War. Second Bank, chartered in 1816, held strong influence over the U.S. economy in the 1810s through its ability to regulate credit and currency. It was upheld as constitutional by the Supreme Court in the case McCulloch v. Maryland, 1819, in which the court ruled that Congress had the authority to delegate its power over the purse to the Second Bank, under the necessary and proper clause of Article 1. Jackson, however, saw the bank as an elitist tool that favored northeastern bankers and trade businesses over southern and western farmers and laborers. So when the National Republicans tried to push for an early recharter of the bank, Jackson vetoed. This was completely uncharted territory. The president had rarely contradicted Congress and the court so openly. In his veto message, Jackson argued that even though the Supreme Court had ruled otherwise, the president had an independent duty to interpret the Constitution. He wrote, "The opinion of the judges has no more authority over Congress than the opinion of Congress has over the judges, and on that point the president is independent of both." Though not in name, this was the birth of the unitary executive theory. It was not the first theory, but it was the first successful challenger to Publius's vision of checks and balances. Federalist 51st, sometimes called the structure of the government, must furnish the proper checks and balances between the different departments, gives us this interpretation of the distribution of power. This policy of supplying by opposite and rival interests, the defect of better motives, might be traced through the whole system of human affairs, private as well as public. We see it particularly displayed in all the subordinate distributions of power, where the constant aim is to divide and arrange the several offices in such a manner as that each may be a check on the other, that the private interest of every individual may be a sentinel over the public rights. These inventions of prudence cannot be less requisite in the distribution of the supreme powers of the state. In Federalist 51st, the founders argue for a system which does incorporate distributions of power which act as checks on one another. Though we often assume this to mean that Congress and Supreme Court act as checks on the president, Federalist 51 actually goes into great detail to explain that everyone should be a check on the other parties. Second, it is of great importance in a republic, not only to guard the society against the oppression of its rulers, but to guard one part of the society against the injustice of the other part. Different interests necessarily exist in different classes of citizens. If a majority be united by a common interest, the rights of the minority will be insecure. There are but two methods of providing against this evil. The one by creating a will in the community independent of the majority, that is, of the society itself. The other by comprehending the society so many separate descriptions of citizens, as will render an unjust combination of a majority of the whole very improbable, if not impracticable. But the Federalist Papers aren't law. They were the open expressions of distaste for the faulty Articles of Confederation. While they tell us the founders' intents, they are not stare decisis. The third theory, independent agency doctrine, is actually quite young in comparison to the other two, only established in 1935 as a result of Humphrey's executor, V. Wayne, United States. In 1933, President Franklin D. Roosevelt fired Federal Trade Commissioner William Humphrey over policy disagreements, despite the Federal Trade Commission Act directly stipulating that commissioners could only be removed for cause, as in, could only be removed for inefficiency or misconduct. Humphrey's estate sued, and the Supreme Court unanimously decided in Humphrey's favor. Since then, Congress has leaned heavily into independent agency doctrine when drafting new agency acts, to ensure that it remains subject to Congress and not to the President. And those are our three constitutional theories of presidential power. Checks and balances, where each of the three branches of government act as checks on one another by supplying opposite and rival interests. The unitary executive, where the president holds plenary executive power over the office and all executive agencies, and independent agencies, where agencies, which hold executive power, must be independent from the executive office. How these interpretations of the Constitution have been used, though, that's where it gets interesting to me. You might want to map one or more of these theories to different political parties, but history will show us something special. The president is not always the same as the party. Let's go all the way back first. Back to a man I think we can all agree upon, George Washington. Despite having a level of popular support no president would ever see following him, he was a very careful first president. He worked closely with Congress to sign into existence the Bill of Rights, and he created a cabinet in order to better cooperate with Congress through appointed specialists. At this time, we had no advisory bodies defined within the Constitution, and this became a practical tool to bring consultants into the office of the executive by allowing Congress to approve such appointments. Of course, he made some decisions considered kingly as well. The Neutrality Proclamation of 1793 asserted an independent executive power to refuse to take sides in foreign war. Thomas Jefferson is such an interesting case. His opponents would declare him very kingly, making liberal use of plenary executive power to purchase Louisiana without congressional approval. Despite this, he found himself working closely, if sometimes oppositionally, with Congress to decrease the size of government through cutting military and other spending, which was seen at the time as aligned with checks and balances because it limited executive overreach regarding Congress's control of the purse. Abraham Lincoln defined the war powers that most anti-war activists despise these days by suspending habeas corpus, issuing the Emancipation Proclamation, and raising armies without congressional approval. Congress was not happy with Lincoln at all, and they felt powerless in the face of the actions Lincoln took to execute this war. In Ex parte Merryman, 1861, Chief Justice Roger Taney ruled against Lincoln's suspension of habeas corpus, but Lincoln just ignored him. This highlighted how crisis drives the expansion of executive power. Ulysses S. Grant wielded expanded powers to enforce Reconstruction, deploying federal troops on US soil to uphold civil rights. His hands-off stance toward Congress, though, let corruption like the credit mobilier scandal fester, prompting Congress to boost its own oversight. Teddy Roosevelt's stewardship theory, a unitary executive forerunner, held that he could act unless forbidden. He used it to create national parks and bust trusts, expanding executive power despite court pushback, like in Kansas v. Fee, Colorado, 1907, setting a bold precedent. William Howard Taft countered with restraint, backing the independent agency doctrine by expanding the Interstate Commerce Commission's autonomy via the Mann-Elkins Act of 1910, free from executive meddling. Herbert Hoover favored checks and balances, staying hands-off during the Depression. As the crisis worsened, he tapped federal funds to launch the Reconstruction Finance Corporation with Congress, aiding banks and businesses. Franklin Delano Roosevelt would make excellent use of the Reconstruction Finance Corporation model, and lean heavily into stewardship theory-like choices on popular issues in the New Deal era. Though he made many of the civilian agencies with which we're familiar today, it was the case, Humphrey's executor, v. United States, which reinforced the nascent independent agency doctrine, restricting the executive from removing agency heads without cause. But it wasn't until the Gipper, Ronald Reagan, that the unitary executive theory was formalized, given a name and an army of lawyers to assert its defense. Through strategic use of signing statements, executive orders, centralized regulatory oversight, and advocacy through the Justice Department, Reagan's team, and particularly his Attorney General, Edwin Meese, reshaped the balance of power between the three branches of government. Reagan's precedent was founded on Hamilton's Federalist 70, which argued for a vigorous executive, Andrew Jackson's precedent in the Bank War, and Abraham Lincoln's expansive wartime powers. Central to the theory was Meese's core statement: the president's power to execute the laws is not subject to diminution by Congress, and supporting this with framers' intent arguments. He also asserted that independent agencies infringed upon Article 2, which states that the executive power shall be vested in a President of the United States of America, not a president and his many agencies, which hold executive power but are not subject to executive oversight. He would go on to argue. And of everyone to work within these theories of executive power, Bill Clinton represents the most confusing. He just seemed to use all three depending on how he felt that day. Clinton made extensive use of signing statements, executive orders, and more to further his environmental and welfare agendas. But the opposition minority could not make any legal constraint on his use of power stick. He would work closely with Congress when they would work with him, and he would work with the agencies and give them far more leeway than Congress would when Congress would not work with him. Checks and balances seemed almost a joke, given the only thing they could impeach him with was the Monica Lewinsky scandal. No party owns any one position on these constitutional issues, and the conditions of the time combined with the personality of the president determines what tools at their disposal they'll use to do what they want to do. But this brings us to the modern day. What is the unitary executive theory? The unitary executive theory fueled Bush's warrantless wiretapping post 9/11 and was used for extrajudicial military commissions for terrorists. Obama used the unitary executive theory to pass deferred action for childhood arrivals, but also to weaponize the IRS into targeting conservative groups in 2013. It's an interpretation of the specific wording of Article 2, which says that the president holds all of the executive power. The independent agencies doctrine, too, is still broadly used. Elizabeth Warren created the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau such that it has oversight but is not overseen, or to defend countless rotating door policies for agency positions. It was originally used by presidents to demonstrate respect for checks and balances, but became a tool for Congress to expand their powers. And of course, the checks and balances still exist in theory, but in practice, checks and balances are undermined by both Congress and the president to accomplish what they see as in the interests of their constituents. The Supreme Court, subject to both presidential appointment and congressional approval, find themselves in the most difficult political positions just to maintain the authority of their own check and balance. These theories, in and of themselves, are not good, nor are they evil. Much like everything else, it can be summed up with the Feynman quote: "To each of us is given a key to the gates of heaven. This same key will open the gates to hell." And so it is with science. So, is the president constrained? Yes, the president is constrained, but not in the way you or I might be constrained by the law. Laws constraining the president often don't exist until after they act, and the courts step in. There are real constraints, real laws which bind the president, but they're extremely conditional. But be very careful jumping to conclusions about them. Just because the conclusion was reached on that specific matter at that time does not mean it necessarily applies to any current event without the judicial review of constitutional law. But can the president stand in Times Square and shoot a man? Only if his lawyers can argue it was in the interest of national security or the public welfare.